Okay, excellent. Well, I'm pleased today on this episode of the Insurtech Leadership Podcast to be joined by Dan Griffith. He is the founder and principal consultant at Greater Gain Group, a go-to-market firm, that's a lot of G's, that specializes in helping software and technology companies, most of them international, land and scale in the U.S. insurance, financial services, and healthcare markets. Dan has spent 30 years in enterprise sales and marketing, including a stretch as the first U.S. sales hire for a South African company that he helped scale from $3 million to $150 million in 3 years. He now runs a 90-day go-to-market playbook for founders who are about to make the most expensive mistake of their company's life, hiring a U.S. sales team before they have a U.S. sales motion. In this conversation, we get into why the unicorn salesperson who can fly the plane while building it is the most dangerous hire an international founder can make, what actually has to be true before you put a rep in a seat, and where the Insurtech market is creating real demand for cross-border go-to-market right now. Welcome, Dan.
Well, thank you, Josh. I'm glad to join you. I've listened to your podcast a number of times. Glad to be a guest on here.
Yeah, well, thanks. I appreciate the feedback, and likewise, I'm pleased to have you on. So, I gave a background on you, and, we had a chance to connect a few weeks back. And so the more I learned about the specifics of what you do, I thought it could be valuable for, frankly, folks in any industry, but particularly as it relates to, insurance and Insurtech as well. So, maybe if you want to just provide a little bit more detail, maybe fill in any gaps that I didn't cover in the intro there.
Yeah, so I think I like to tell people this is probably a 15-year effort on my part. But like you had mentioned, I've gotten to work with a number of companies in individual roles, having to be that unicorn salesperson that they go and come to the U.S. and they hand you your laptop and they say, okay, go sell us some stuff. And I learned a lot of hard lessons on how not to do things. And from that, I thought, okay, there's certain mistakes that people make every time that they come in. How can I help companies avoid that? And I started by just doing fractional, I'll say sales leadership work. But I realized even that wasn't doing a lot for these companies, because when I would leave, they would drop off. So I said, there's got to be a formula here or a framework that we can put together that will help these companies go from I'm coming to the US market, or I'm entering the Insurtech market, or I'm scaling beyond founder-led sales to I can now hire a salesperson and they're going to be successful. So that was really kind of the inception of what we do at Greater Gain Group.
Got it. So not asking you to put anybody on blast, but what would be the first tell, say, in the first 30 minutes of meeting an international founder that they're going to flame out trying to land in the U.S.?
Well, that they're going to go hire a sales and marketing team. I actually wrote an article, gosh, it's probably been 4 or 5 years ago now. It said, seriously, don't hire salespeople. And everybody kind of freaked out, right? They're like, what do you mean? We don't hire salespeople. Well, what happens is, I think a lot of times with people coming into the U.S. market, they go, okay, I'm just going to hire somebody that worked for one of my large competitors, and they're going to be able to replicate that success for my company. A lot of downfalls on that. We can certainly talk some more about that later, but that's normally kind of my first tell when they say, okay, I'm going to go hire a salesperson, a marketing person, a business development person. They're going to try to replace kind of the hard work of figuring out the market by trying to hire people.
And so if you were to back up and, advise that same international founder the right way to start, is that a year in advance? Is that 2 years in advance? And, what do the steps look like leading up to a meeting where you actually know they've got their ducks in a row?
Well, I think For us, a lot of times they've had some level of success in their principal market, right? Whether that be Norway or South Africa or Korea, wherever they might be coming to the US from. I would say we like to get engaged with them at the point where they've made the decision, they've done any product localization they need to do, but they've not really yet done anything else. Because at that point, we can still go, who exactly is your market, right? Who, and we say the market, we get really, really granular on that, to the point of it's going to be a chief actuary at a life insurance company that, or let's just say a chief actuary at a reinsurance company that is acquiring books of business to administer. So that's very specific. And then we get to, the problems and challenges, but we really want to get to them before they go into the market thinking that they know something that they may not know. So that's kind of the first step in the process that we go through with our clients. I hope did that answer your question? I feel like maybe I didn't answer it.
No, I think it does. I guess to kind of really go from an idea to something that's an executable plan on the ground in the US, maybe if there's a little bit more about that timeline or the steps in that process.
Okay. Yeah. So I think there's some things that obviously need to be done prior to us engaging. There's certainly sometimes some registration, sometimes there's some security, some SOC too. But I think I would say they should really start. I'd say 6 to 9 months. I don't think it has to be longer than that. As you well know, in the insurance space, a lot of stuff can be tied to budget cycles. So I always try to advise people, to think about that. I jokingly say that in insurance, as well as finance, healthcare, really a lot of the highly regulated markets, nobody does anything the first 3 months of the year, right? And then everybody panics and a lot of stuff gets done April, May, June, and then they start building their budget for next year. And in the fourth quarter, they spend the money that they didn't spend during the year and are trying to keep in their budget. So I think also thinking about that, because I think trying to launch, there are some times in a year where you want to launch, but I think 6 to 9 months as some runway is a good amount of time.
Got it. And so, when you get involved and people have already made some mistakes, like, we talked about losing $2 million. So does it take 6 months to lose $2 million? Does it take a year? Does it take 2 years? Like, what are you usually walking into if they haven't gotten it right the first time?
Yeah. And like I said, we hope to catch people before that, but unfortunately, I'd say 50% of our customers have already made one or even multiple attempts and they're mistaken. If you think about your cash burn, you can get to 2 million in a year pretty darn quick. Because you think about, you go hire a VP of sales, it's about 350,000. You might hire, 2 account executives. That's 150. That's salary only, no burden for but you're right there. You have $250,000 or $750,000. You hire a marketing person. That's going to put you up to 1.2, 1.3. You get an office somewhere. You're going to several conferences and travel, and boom, you're at 2 million. The problem is that nothing is built when you've got that. I mean, you're literally just throwing people into the mix and hoping that they'll figure out how your product applies in the U.S. market. It's that's an expensive gamble.
Yeah. And a lot of times I'll talk to founders or part of the founding team, and one of them is coming over, either landing for a period of time or traveling back and forth pretty frequently from their home market. Can that work, or do you really need to have boots on the ground here?
No, I think to us, that's the absolute way you should do it. I believe that depending on the size of the company. I mean, if the company's already a couple hundred million, probably not feasible. But if you're less than 50 million, having the founder come and have those initial conversations and to have an ear down to the market, I think is highly, highly critical. That's why we like to say we help them convert from founder-led sales to a team-led sales approach. But I think the founder, it's very important for them to hear what's going on in the market, hear the objections, kind of understand that, because that's going to help for a lot of things. Number one, communicating with the team that you eventually build, but number two, communicating with your investors and just making sure that you're tacking in the right direction.
Got it. And what do you find when you talk to founders or whoever leading these initiatives are sort of the typical assumptions they make that, commonly turn out to be off base?
I think
let me add on to that. I don't mean so much about org design piece, but about what they're going to be confronting in the U.S. market versus what they're used to at home.
Yeah, so I think certainly there's differences in the insurance system, between, say, for instance, European system, or even in the health insurance side in the single payer system versus a multi-payer. So I think that's one thing that's always common. I think people forget. I think the thing that astounds them is probably the number one thing is they say, boy, I had a great conversation with that person and I never heard from them again. And I think that typically indicates that you didn't bring a level of value in that initial conversation, a kind of what's in it for me for your prospect that you're talking with. So they're very, you had a great conversation. You talked about your kids, you talked about cooking, you talked about travel, you talked about your product some, but there's nothing in it for the person you're talking to. So in the US market, people move on quickly, right? I mean, and I think the second piece is leaving that initial call without an established follow-up. To me, I see that happen all the time. Josh, just you and I talking, right? If we hadn't gotten off the call a couple of weeks ago and set a follow-up, we wouldn't be having this podcast today, right? Because everybody's busy. And I think that's one thing that I see, the mistake I see being made, that people are kind of astounded, because I think the European market is probably much smaller, but it's also much more relationship-based. As much as I hate to say it, our U.S. market's transactional. If you don't bring value, then you're out.
Yeah. Yeah. What about sort of, the level of specialization or the market, just the competitive landscape in general compared to what they may be used to?
I actually think of that as a positive, because I think the depth of the market here and the breadth is much wider. So you have, if you're calling on life insurance companies, right? I mean, in the US, you've got, there's a huge kind of spectrum of life insurance companies, and you've got TPAs and you got reinsurance. You got a lot of kind of different players in that market. So I think that's important. I also think that in the Insurtech space, a lot of people make the mistake of going, okay, I'm just going to call on who my end customer would be, which is some type of an insurance company or provider or a benefits manager. But I always say, well, what about other technology companies, right? Because especially in the age of AI, you've got kind of maybe some aging tech. So I think that's, I always tell people, let's think about it in a much broader sense. And maybe somebody that you might think of as a competitor could actually sell, you could sell as a white label product there. So I think the depth and the breadth of the market is bigger. I think from a competitive standpoint, ultimately, if you're solving a person's or a problem or a challenge, that's your competitor is not anybody but the status quo. And I know that sounds kind of cheesy, but it's the truth. I mean, if you all that other noise can be out there, and if you're getting into a feature function benefit, you've lost already. But if it's a problem or a challenge, and then you're just competing as to how painful is that, and how much will they pay to replace, to solve the problem or challenge.
Yeah. And do you find that folks coming into the U.S. market are used to the sort of paid pilot MSA scale process, or are they used to something different?
That's a really good question. And matter of fact, I now that I'm thinking back on stuff that we talked about before, I'm glad you brought, because that is one thing that people, I think, is a little bit strange. I think I always tell people, look, don't do a free pilot. There's no value from the side of the customer, and you're going to end up spending a lot of time and getting absolutely nothing out of it. People will pay for pilots here. So I think that is one thing that maybe maybe a stronger outside the U.S. There's people will only do an unpaid pilot. Here, people do the paid pilots. And then I think making sure that you've got your core things that you can't negotiate on, but make them a very, very short list. Because ultimately, an insurance company's got 10 times as many lawyers as you'll ever have. And you're going to have to probably sign an MSA that gives you a little bit of heartburn. But realize that sometimes MSAs are for the worst case scenarios. And they're not really, they're very difficult to negotiate. And I think that's something that people miss. Really the power's there. But again, you do a good job on it, you're gonna be okay. I'm not a lawyer, nor am I telling people to ignore the lawyer's advice. I'm just saying, I do see some people come in with a lot of rigidity, and they're just not going to penetrate the market that way.
So, if you were to lay out an ideal playbook, what are the pieces to get in place, and what's the timetable typically to get them in place?
So I think first, making sure that your product is ready from a U.S. standpoint. So if you're hosted, let's make sure you can host in the U.S. If you're, if you need to have a very strong security story, right? Probably SOC 2 is and sometimes that's the license to play in a lot of these markets. So I think you want to get, make sure that the product piece is ready, and then really understand who you're going to go after. We like to say no less than 3 market segments, no more than 5. And, understand who you're going to call on there. What's the pain or problem and challenge you're solving for them? Where do they look to solve that? That's kind of what we do as part of our framework. And then have an outreach engine in place that's going to generate not leads, but generate sales conversations for you, because a lead has no value. I think in today's world, I was just on a call recently where somebody was asking me, what's the difference between a BDR and an SDR and an account executive? And I said, well, I think today most of those, they're blended together, right? You're doing it all in one person, and they're using a lot of AI to do it. But I think making sure that you have, again, that outreach engine. And then third, you want to have a process, right? That goes from initial expression of interest to closed deal. Understand what that is. Understand what things run in parallel, entry and exit criteria, your legal, kind of what you need to do there. So yeah, so that's to me the kind of the things. And I would say you could get those in place over a 3 to 4 month period.
And do you find that international companies coming into the U.S. encounter different expectations around pricing models and kind of have to adapt from where they've started to how people buy in the U.S. or the type of structures people are used to in the U.S.?
I would say that overall, people that are coming from outside the U.S. market typically price too low. So they price, many times they're pricing, 20, 30, 40% too low, because I think that the U.S. market is, a little more inflated. And I think also understanding corporate budgets. The corporate budgets are just much larger. I was just again on a call with somebody talking about calling on a health insurance company at the end of the year one time, and I was bringing a company to the U.S. from France, and we were trying to get a proof of concept in there, and they didn't think they weren't sure about doing a paid proof of concept, and so basically I talked to the CTO. We went to lunch. He said, "Hey, I'm going to go look and let's see what I've got in my budget left for this year." And he came back and said, would 475,000 be enough? And I was like, "Oh yeah, that's just enough." Jokingly saying that, but I think a lot of times people they underprice coming into the U.S. market or don't understand really what the market is.
Are there leadership capabilities that maybe are required for entering a new market, entering the U.S. market, that aren't required for getting a business off the ground in a local international market? Or if you've been able to do that, then you should be able to do this.
I would say there's two things that I see with founders that are coming to the U.S. that are kind of hallmarks of success. The one is willingness to be aggressive. I think that's the one thing that people get run over when they come to the U.S. market because they're not aggressive. I'm not saying be rude or obstinate. I'm just saying to not be afraid to be aggressive. If somebody doesn't follow up with you after they say, "Hey, let me get back at the end of the day," if you don't hear back from following up with, right? I have European founders. Sometimes they'll sit back a month. Well, by that time, they probably already bought something else and have it installed and they're moving on. So I think aggressiveness is the one thing, and I think the second thing is the willingness to take a risk and fail fast. I know that gets tossed around a lot, but you're going to have to make some experiments, and not all of them are going to work. That's why we tell our clients 3 to 5 market segments. Chances are, if you got 5, 2 of those are going to be flops. They're not going to work. But I think the willing to be aggressive and the willingness to fail fast is I think those are 2 hallmarks that I see for people that are successful and then people that aren't.
And what about the balance between local decision making in the U.S. versus centralized decision making out of the home office or somewhere else overseas? And is there one way you kind of always have to do it, or do you hand from one to the other when you hit a certain inflection point? How do you advise on that?
So I think that goes back to something we talked about earlier, Josh, about the founder being involved in those cycles, because that does give some eyes on the market and some real world experience, because it is very, I've worked for companies in my experience that made all the calls from the European office, which you can get away with as long as you have somebody with their ear to the ground in the market. I always tell people there's no reason to move and open an office here until you've literally got a nice full pipeline, right? I mean, it's you can sell very easily, of course, in the days of Zoom, and very rarely do you ever meet in person anymore unless you go to an event. You can do that, but I think the founder being involved there is important, and or if it's not the founder, a co-founder that is there and listening and has their ear to the market. I think there's some general things that you can make, in the, back at the home office. One thing I always tell people too is sell the product you have. Don't change your product to fit the market. That's a big mistake that a lot of people make, because what they end up doing is customizing it for one customer, and they have nothing, that's got broad market appeal. And I think the tendency is sometimes you'll have a big insurer that'll come along, or a big financial services company will say, "Oh yeah, I want this, this, and this," and you fundamentally change your product, and then you've basically just got a custom dev product that you made for somebody. So I think that's kind of a bonus answer to what you're talking about. But I think keeping on that product roadmap is important, and that should be driven from the home office.
Do you see the successful playbook having to change at all over the coming 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? Is maybe there's more industry consolidation, or AI has more impact either in how businesses operate, or just new AI driven products that enter into the Insurtech and insurance landscape?
I think you're going to have an even more obsessive focus on proof of concepts. I don't see anybody being able to sell anything without that now, because there's so many investments, even in the AI market, that have not really turned out for what people wanted them to be, even though there's lots of money there. So I could see that changing. I also will see. I think you're going to find a lot more joint development. I'm starting to see that, especially in the insurance space, where you've got a large insurer, you've got a company that has got a product, but maybe not totally there yet. So they want to develop jointly and market it jointly. That I think those are the two areas where I could see some significant changes.
And then the last one for me is, like, forget the the playbooks and the the sort of ideal way to do things. Is there anything that's just like total curveball, or outside the box that almost always comes up, or occasionally you've seen that would surprise folks trying to enter the U.S. market?
This is going to sound strange, but it's always the size of the market. I think people are always surprised at how big and diverse the market is. And like I said, it may not necessarily be just insurance, right? It could be other tech companies. It could be. It's just there's a breadth and depth to the market that always seems to surprise, I think, people when they come here. And that means you can find a niche a lot easier, and there's a lot of those niches that you can fit into that are there. I think the second thing that people are always surprised about is, even though we complain about regulatory, in a way, is it's still a little bit of the wild, wild west. People are very surprised, especially when it comes to data regulations and AI, how open the market is.
Well, Dan, appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts on go-to-market in the U.S. and the insurance and Insurtech overlay. Anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up today?
Well, I'd like to encourage people not to be scared to do it. I think this is this can be a big boost for your company, and I think there's a lot of opportunity in the U.S. market. So I wouldn't say, even though we gave some cautionary tales today, definitely think about doing it. And talk to somebody. If it's not me or Josh or somebody else that find somebody that knows what they're doing and just get some advice from them. But take the leap. I think it's going to be worth it.
All right, great. Well, Dan, thanks again for being on today. And it's Dan Griffith, founder and principal consultant at Greater Gain Group. And thanks so much for being on.
Thanks, Josh. Look forward to seeing you soon.
All right. Take care.